What if everything you thought international cuisine meant missed the most important part? Most people think international cuisine is about taste, about curiosity, about chefs crossing borders, and cultures blending naturally over time. They're not wrong, but they're missing something. In 1492, a single voyage began what historians now call the Columbian Exchange. Within a century, over 60% of the world's calorie crops were growing outside their original continents. By the early 1800s, sugar consumption in Britain had increased nearly fivefold compared to the 17th century. Today, just 4 crops, wheat, rice, maize, and soy, account for more than half of global caloric intake. On the surface, international cuisine looks like celebration. Underneath, it is logistics, it is empire, it is labor systems, it is shipping lanes, commodity exchanges, and multinational food conglomerates. It is power expressed through the ordinary act of eating. This is not a story about recipes. It is a story about patterns. When certain ingredients move, certain economies rise. When certain trade routes open, certain cultures reshape themselves. When certain corporations consolidate supply chains, certain cuisines disappear. Let me show you how. Because international cuisine didn't emerge from curiosity alone. It emerged from a repeating architecture of trade, extraction, migration, and standardization. And that architecture is still shaping what's on the plate today. In the late 15th century, kitchens across Europe looked radically different from what we imagine now. There were no tomatoes in Italy, no chili peppers in Hungary, no potatoes in Ireland, no chocolate in Switzerland. The idea of Italian food without tomatoes would have been normal. The idea of Indian food without chilies would have been ordinary. The surface narrative tells us that explorers discovered new lands and brought back exciting ingredients. It frames this exchange as adventurous and inevitable. But the records tell a more structured story. After Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, Spanish and Portuguese ships began transporting crops, animals, and people across the Atlantic. Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1600, over 300 plant species were transferred between the Old and New Worlds. Maize moved to Africa. Cassava moved to Southeast Asia. Tomatoes and chili peppers entered Europe, and then traveled east through Ottoman trade networks into South Asia. This wasn't casual exchange, it was organized commerce. The Spanish crown issued detailed trade licenses. The Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated cargo and imposed taxes. By 1600, Seville had become one of Europe's wealthiest ports, largely due to agricultural imports from the Americas. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Entire culinary identities were forming around ingredients that had not existed in those regions just a century earlier. Italian tomato sauces only became common in the 18th century. Chili peppers, now central to Thai and Indian cuisine, were introduced by Portuguese traders in the 16th century. The official story frames this as cultural enrichment. But here's what most people don't understand. These movements were inseparable from coercion. Sugar is a clear example. In 1650, annual sugar consumption in England was about 2 pounds per person. By 1800, it had risen to approximately 18 pounds per person. That 7-fold increase was powered by plantation systems in the Caribbean. Between 1500 and 1867, roughly 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic slave trade. Sugar sweetened European tea. But it was cultivated through violence. Follow the chain. European demand for sugar led to plantation expansion. Plantation expansion required labor. Labor was supplied through transatlantic slavery. The profits financed further colonial expansion. The ingredients on the table were directly tied to systems of extraction. The same pattern appears in spices. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company controlled large parts of the global spice trade. At its peak around 1669, it was arguably the world's most valuable company, with assets equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's dollars. Nutmeg and cloves from the Banda Islands were monopolized. When local populations resisted, Dutch forces executed or displaced thousands to secure control. On the surface, Europeans developed a taste for exotic flavors. Underneath, corporations used military force to dominate supply. International cuisine was not spreading randomly. It was following power. Consider rice. Originally domesticated in Asia, rice cultivation expanded through trade and forced migration. Enslaved Africans brought rice-growing knowledge to the American South. By the 18th century, South Carolina's economy was heavily dependent on rice exports built on enslaved labor. By 1770, rice accounted for over 20% of the colony's export value. Think about that. A staple food in Asia becomes a cash crop in North America because labor and knowledge were forcibly moved across oceans. This was the foundation. By the 19th century, industrialization accelerated everything. Steamships reduced Atlantic crossing times from months to weeks. Refrigerated shipping, introduced in the 1870s, allowed meat to be transported from Argentina and Australia to Europe. Grain markets became global. The Chicago Board of Trade, founded in 1848, standardized futures contracts for wheat and corn. Cuisines were no longer local adaptations. They were increasingly tied to global commodity markets. The official narrative still described this as progress. More food, cheaper food, greater variety. But the underlying mechanism was consolidation. Power concentrated in trading houses, shipping firms, and later multinational food processors. The pattern was becoming clearer. When trade networks expand, ingredients move. When ingredients move, cuisines transform. But those movements are rarely neutral. They are shaped by whoever controls transport, labor, and capital. And by the early 20th century, that control would intensify dramatically. Which brings us to the hidden architecture. By 1900, global trade in agricultural commodities had multiplied several times over compared to 1800. Steamships and telegraph cables compressed time and space. Grain prices in London could respond to harvest reports from Kansas within days. The world's food systems were becoming synchronized. But synchronization required infrastructure. Railroads linked inland farms to coastal ports. In the United States, railroad mileage expanded from about 30,000 miles in 1860 to over 193,000 miles by 1900. That network allowed Midwestern wheat to flow toward European markets. It also allowed meatpacking companies like Armour and Swift to centralize slaughterhouses in Chicago, processing millions of animals annually. This wasn't simply efficiency, it was structural control. When meatpacking became centralized, independent butchers disappeared. When grain grading standards were standardized, farmers became dependent on centralized exchanges. When canning technology advanced, food could be stored and shipped across continents. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a farmer in Kansas in 1890, your wheat price was no longer determined by local demand. It was determined by global markets. If European harvests were strong, your income dropped. If shipping rates rose, your margins shrank. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. In British India, colonial authorities promoted cash crops like tea and indigo over subsistence crops. By the early 20th century, India had become one of the largest tea exporters in the world. Tea was consumed in Britain at rates exceeding 6 pounds per person annually by 1900. On the surface, tea was cultural, afternoon rituals, porcelain cups, social identity. Underneath, it was an imperial commodity chain. Land allocation decisions in Assam affected breakfast tables in London, Labor conditions on plantations determined profit margins for British firms. The logic was simple: secure land, secure labor, secure transport, secure markets. This architecture didn't disappear after colonial empires formally ended, it evolved. After World War II, new institutions shaped global food flows. The Food and Agriculture Organization was founded in 1945. The World Bank began financing agricultural development projects. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade reduced barriers to international trade. In 1960, global fertilizer use was about 30 million metric tons. By 2000, it exceeded 140 million metric tons annually. The Green Revolution introduced high-yield wheat and rice varieties, particularly in Mexico and India. Between 1961 and 2000, global cereal production more than doubled. The official story celebrated hunger reduction. And in many regions, calorie availability did increase. But the system required dependence on patented seeds, chemical inputs, and global supply chains. Follow the chain again. High-yield crops required fertilizers and irrigation. Fertilizers required petrochemicals. Petrochemicals tied agriculture to fossil fuel markets. Farmers needed credit to purchase inputs. Credit tied them to financial institutions. International cuisine became less about diversity and more about standardization. By the late 20th century, multinational corporations dominated food processing. Companies like Nestlé, founded in 1866, expanded globally into packaged foods and beverages. McDonald's, established in 1940 and franchised widely after 1955, operated in over 100 countries by the early 21st century. Coca-Cola, first introduced in 1886, became one of the most widely distributed products on Earth. On the surface, this was cultural exchange. Burgers in Tokyo, pizza in São Paulo, fried chicken in Manila.